If you were a gamer growing up in the late 1980s through the early 1990s, there's every chance that you will remember the good old-fashioned genre that was a side-scrolling beat-em-up. It was such a simple premise really. Walk along a 2D axis and beat the ever-living shit out of anyone that you saw. I remember playing the 1984 IREM coin-op Kung Fu Master, which was known as Spartan X in Japan, playing as a devastatingly ferocious martial arts expert, Thomas, who had to rescue his girlfriend Sylvia by kicking to death hundreds of people, and I was instantly hooked on the premise. And a quick fun fact here, this game was ported to the Nintendo NES simply as Kung Fu, and it was directed by some guy called Shigeru Miyamoto, who is apparently quite a big deal for some reason or another. Anyway, the concept evolved into not just side-scrolling, but depth-scrolling too, first debuting in the Technos arcade classic Renegade. In this one, you play as Mr. K, who also has to rescue his girlfriend. Renegade essentially set out a host of fundamental basics that still exist today in beat-em-ups. The double tap to dash, the grab attacks, and the dreaded pit to throw enemies into for an insta-kill. Technos were also behind the all-conquering Double Dragon in 1987, a game where you play as Billy and Jimmy in two-player mode, who have to, you'll never guess, save their girlfriend, Marion, from some gang boss. I'm not sure whose girlfriend it is, and I've got no idea why every martial arts brawler in video game world has their missus kidnapped, but we've got to go with what we've got. Double Dragon was a monster, becoming the best performing arcade game in the US in 1987. Incredibly, it was also the best performing arcade game of 1998 too. It couldn't make it a hat-trick though, as the best performing game in the US for 1989 went to a game called Final Fight. A Stonewall classic 2D beat-em-up with an utterly unique and never seen before plot in which the Mad Gear gang have kidnapped your girlfriend, Jessica. Shock horror. And you've got to beat the shit out of every gang member on your way to rescue her. The plots may have about the same amount of variety as a tub of fucking Pringles, but I promise you, these games were all bloody excellent. So Final Fight, after huge commercial and critical success, was announced as a Super Nintendo exclusive launch title, and first arrived on the Super Famicom in Japan on November the 21st, 1990 alongside the console. With Nintendo and Sega going head-to-head in an aggressive battle for 16-bit market dominance, Sega knew they needed to act. Side-scrolling beat-em-ups were at the height of their popularity, with other arcade smash hits like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and The Simpsons adopting the formula and causing waves, and Sega's own selection of beat-em-ups for the MegaDrive/Genesis was somewhat less than stellar. And with the biggest arcade brawler of them all now on their rival's platform, Sega decided to strike back by bypassing the arcades and getting a brand new beat-em-up game straight onto consoles. And it was a game that would become one of the most recognised and successful games of its era, and one that has become almost synonymous with Sega's 16-bit machine itself. This, my friends, is Streets of Rage. Now, I grew up in Miami in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and I mentioned in my Moonwalker video recently that I used to pump a lot of quarters into Double Dragon. My dad used to go bowling with work a couple of times a week, and my big brother and I would join him not to bowl, but to pump money into the arcade machines. I could pretty much finish Double Dragon on a single quarter, thanks mostly to the back elbow move by pressing punch and jump together. I managed to get pretty far through The Simpsons and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and there were other games I was pretty good at, like Prisoner of War. I loved beat-em-ups, and Final Fight, when it came along, was by far my favourite. Massive sprites, and each character feeling really different to play, as well as the grapple system and the special move attack that consumed a bunch of health. It got a little overwhelming at times, and Sodom with his two swords can literally fuck himself off into the sea, but it was a great game. As an early Mega Drive adopter, I will be honest that I was a little gutted that Final Fight wouldn't be coming to the platform. Admittedly, it eventually kind of did. The game released in 1993 as Final Fight CD for the Mega CD, and was pretty much the best version of Final Fight you could get at home. But this video isn't about Final Fight, it's about Sega's response to Final Fight. Streets of Rage launched in the US on the 18th of September 1991, a little over a month after the game debuted in Japan under the name Bare Knuckle. It launched in Europe in October 1991, and that year it was basically the only thing I wanted for Christmas alongside Road Rash. And I'm delighted to tell you, I got them both. damn, Christmas Day 1991 was an absolute belter. So where to start with Streets of Rage? For a start, and ready yourselves here, because the plot doesn't involve a kidnapped girlfriend. Nope, instead the story focuses around Wood Oak City, which is subjected to a hostile takeover by a criminal syndicate led by Mr. X, which may or may not be Elon Musk. I mean, there's definite similarities there. Anyway, 3 ex-coppers, all of whom are aged 23 and under, so hardly experienced coppers, decide to take the law into their own hands and fight their way through the city, beating countless goons to death in order to stop Mr. X from taking over the entire city. Right from the start, you can choose between any of the 3 characters, each with their own stats. Adam Hunter, who has strong power and is agile in the air. Axel Stone, who is definitely not modelled on Cody from Final Fight, right? Who balances speed and power. And Blaze Fielding, who excels in speed and agility. There isn't a dramatic difference between the 3 characters, but there is enough there for you to learn and play to each character's strengths. Adam is good at slugging and aerial attacks, Axel is a good all-rounder, and Blaze is a kind of hit-and-move character who is excellent at aerial attacks. The game itself is set across 8 different levels, or rounds, each set in a different part of Wood Oak City. The premise is the same throughout the game. Fight your way from the left of the level to the right, well, apart from the standard trope of the elevator level in Stage 7, and from right to left scrolling in Stage 8, and basically beat everyone up. One of the striking things for me with Streets of Rage is the sheer number of enemies you sometimes have at once. There's regularly times when up to 7 or 8 of them can be on screen at any time, which is a far cry from the 3 maximum the SNES version of Final Fight throws at you. It often becomes a game of simply not getting surrounded and instead making use of the full screen and your aerial abilities to keep the enemies at a bit of a distance so you can methodically beat them to death one by one. Every round except for round 7 has a boss at the end, a much larger, much more powerful and much more tanky enemy that can quickly overwhelm your health bar unless you study their attacks and find a way to damage them efficiently. One of the things I've always loved about Streets of Rage is the grab system. Now it's easiest to do from above or below the enemy, but you can also do it by landing a blow and then pushing the D-pad towards them to grab them. Once you've got them, you can push the attack button to deal some hits, followed by a swift heavy move at the end of the combo. You can also press the attack button and the D-pad away while holding them to throw them, again causing some substantial damage. Uniquely at the time, you could also press the jump button while holding the enemy to transition your hold between in front and behind them. From there you can do a Brock Lesnar style belly to back German suplex, causing some pretty colossal damage to them. Suplex City, bitch! So as well as the grabbing mechanic and the basic fist-to-face method of dishing out damage, there's also a bunch of weapons to be found in Streets of Rage. Some of them are found by smashing objects like bins, phone boxes and barriers, whereas some of them spawn with enemies who will drop them when you knock them down. Weapons include a knife, which can be used as both a melee weapon and thrown across the screen as a ranged weapon, a bottle which breaks the first time you use it but then persists as a melee weapon until you drop it. There's also a baseball bat which you swing for a bigger damage radius than the knife or the bottle, and it can also take down multiple enemies in a single swing, as well as a lead pipe which is basically the same as the baseball bat with a slightly longer range. Finally, there's also a pepper bomb you can pick up and throw which causes any impacted enemy to be stunned for a brief time. Now in fairness, most fighting games include weapons of some description, and while there's nothing to write home about here, there is at least a decent mix. Breaking objects, like I mentioned a moment ago, doesn't just yield weapons as a reward. You can also find food to replenish your health, money bags and gold bars for points, extra lives, and also extra special moves to use on the level. Enemy-wise, there's a reasonable level of variety in the people you have to beat to death, and the game does a reasonable job of making it feel more varied by reusing character models but changing the colour of their outfits. The boss fights are mostly pretty easy to work out their patterns and what works against them. The 2 female bosses that closely resemble Blaze are a bit of a pain in the ass to deal with, but again, some patience and perseverance, and they are by no means insurmountable. At any point, although normally reserved for the boss fight, you can hit the A button where your character calls in support from their seemingly old police force buddies. A police car pulls up, fires some artillery, which then somehow damages every enemy on the screen except for your player, even if you stood right in the middle of the fucking fire circle it creates. And just a little note here for the MegaDrive Genesis connoisseurs among you. You know the car that pulls up to shoot the artillery? Does it look familiar? Well, you might have seen it before, because this very car also appears at the end of Cyber Police EaseWat. You see, during development, Streets of Rage's project name was D-SWAT, and the game's actually set in the same universe as E-SWAT. Totally different games, of course, but that cop car that acts as your special throughout the game is the very same car. So there you go. And while we're talking about cool things, there are actually two different endings to Streets of Rage. The good ending is the canon one, which is the one you achieve in single player. When you manage to finally confront Mr. Twitter, he offers you the chance to join his syndicate as his right-hand man. If you accept, you'll find it was all a ruse, you're sent back to stage 6 and you have to do it all over again. If you say no, you can proceed to kick 7 shades of shit out of him and be the hero. However, in 2-player mode, if one of you says yes and the other says no, Mr. Musk will order you both to fight to the death for his own amusement. Once you've clubbed your best buddy to death, Elon asks you one more time to join his syndicate. At this point, if you say no, the usual last boss fight plays out, and if you're successful, the ending is very different to how it usually finishes. Again, at this point, it's just another little thing that Streets of Rage does incredibly right, because so much of this game is just the genre done right. The movement and the controls are fluid and tight. The collision detection holds up remarkably well. Graphically, it's a really pretty game for its time, particularly with how hard the system is working with the volume of enemies it throws at you. Don't get me wrong, it's not perfect. There's no real combos to speak of, it's not the most difficult game of its type to complete, unless you're playing on hard. But there's so much to like about this game. And I've not even mentioned the soundtrack yet. Now, a little caveat here, the soundtrack is heavily inspired by EDM or electronic dance music. So it is fair to say that your mileage with the soundtrack may vary if dance music isn't your thing. But listen, I was 10 years old when I first played this, and dance music was absolutely not my thing, but even I fell in love with the soundtrack. Created by famed Japanese composer Yuzo Koshiro, the soundtrack to Streets of Rage even spawned multiple albums in Japan, and Koshiro was brought back to direct the music for both Streets of Rage 2 and Streets of Rage 3. He went on to compose the music for Shenmue and Shenmue 2, as well as the Etrian Odyssey series, and he even did the main menu music on the MegaDrive mini console. So celebrated is his work on the Streets of Rage series, he was even brought back to compose some music for Streets of Rage 4 almost 30 years after the last game had released. And it's really not hard to see why, because there's some genuinely excellent songs that accompany you throughout this game. And if you're wondering about the drum beat on the main intro, yes, you may have heard that before too, because the main theme samples the drum beat from Sadness, the breakout single by Enigma. Streets of Rage turned out to be quite an incredible success for Sega. The original game reportedly shifted over 3.5 million units worldwide, amassed strong critical acclaim, spawned multiple sequels, soundtrack albums, and even a comic book series. And it's not hard to see why. With the side-scrolling beat-em-up at the height of its popularity, Sega smashed this one out of the park, delivering a game that didn't necessarily revolutionise the genre, but it took every single trait at the time and made it all come together in a fast, playable, graphically pleasing title with an ear-bendingly brilliant soundtrack. The 3 different characters meant there was an element of variety and replayability. The multiplayer was always brilliant fun playing co-op with a buddy. Honestly, I couldn't tell you how many times I played and finished this game, but even playing it again nearly 35 years since its release, there is no denying that there is something timeless about it. And I'm sorry, but I do have to compare it again to the Final Fight port for the Super Nintendo. Whereas the arcade version of Final Fight had 3 playable characters, the SNES version only had Cody and Haga. A couple of years later, Final Fight Guy was released in Japan, which replaced Cody with Guy, so even then it only had 2 playable characters. The SNES port of Final Fight was missing the industrial area stage from the arcade, and, more annoyingly, it was also missing the 2-player mode. The SNES version could only manage a maximum of 3 baddies on the screen at once as well. Streets of Rage, though, had none of these issues or niggles. The game was a reasonably generous 8 stages, it offered 3 characters right out of the box, it had 2-player support right out of the box, it had a screen full of enemies, and it didn't feel like I was getting shortchanged. So yeah, I was a Streets of Rage guy back then, and to be honest, I'm still a Streets of Rage guy now. Streets of Rage was exclusive to the Mega Drive for a little while, although it was eventually ported to both the Sega Master System and the Sega Game Gear. And while there's obviously some compromises in the 8-bit versions, they're actually both really decent ports. The music is replicated really well. The Master System version is basically the same game, though it is a little more sluggish than the mighty Mega Drive version. And even the portable Game Gear version holds up well, the major difference being only having 2 players to choose from. It seems Adam couldn't be fucked to save the 8-bit portable street, so he just left it to Axel and Blaze to go it themselves. The jumping is wildly out of whack on the Game Gear too, and the weapons are incredibly overpowered, making the game stupidly easy. But on the whole, the 8-bit versions are still well worth a look. So to sum it all up, Streets of Rage was a hugely successful game at the time, and it's forged an excellent legacy as one of the most recognisable and most definitive 2D brawlers going. And even today, almost 35 years on, it's so easy to see why. I know some of you will perhaps look back at this and tell me that, yeah, but it's not as good as Streets of Rage 2, and it's a point I take on board. I may just go back to the sequel and do a retrospective on that too. But for now, this video is on the original, the one that started it all. The punt that Sega took, which paid off big time. I'm as guilty as anyone for sometimes having rose-tinted views on some of my favourite games from my younger days. But let me tell you, Streets of Rage is a stone-cold classic. The impact, the graphics, the sound effects, the music, the co-op, the suplex city, the throwing baddies through the phone boxes, the twatting them with a bat, the cheeky backhander to the chin, everything here is just a blast to play through. And if you've never played it, I would highly suggest that you do. Thanks so much for watching, and for all the super positive comments and support on these retro retrospectives. I'd be super grateful if you could drop this video a like, and even more super grateful if you dropped a free subscription to the channel. Unbelievably, I'm well on the way to making YouTube partner here, so I genuinely appreciate all of you. I'll be back soon with another retrospective, but in the meantime, be awesome to each other, and I unconditionally love your hecking faces.